Chicago, Illinois, October 19, 1897. George M. Pullman, the man who made it possible to travel in comfort, and who bears the distinction of having precipitated the greatest strike on record in America, and who has succeeded where others failed in establishing a communal town, died suddenly of a heart attack at 5 o'clock this morning. Mr. Pullman's death occurred in his magnificent brownstone home at the corner of Prairie Avenue and 18th Street, where he lived for many years. Mr. Pullman, while in apparently good health recently, formerly had some stomach troubles, which he largely attributed to the condition of his eyes. His belief was that all the bodily ills were due to his eyes. Mr. Pullman's fortune is variously estimated from $30 million to $50 million. Mr. Pullman's death affected the Chicago stock market quite appreciably. He is said to have been a heavy holder of both Diamond Match and New York Biscuit Security, two of the most active stocks listed on the local exchange. When the announcement of Mr. Pullman's death was posted on the bulletin board, it caused a fall in the later stock of 3¼ points. He was a great man, tested by the Napoleonic empressism. He did something. Outside the workshop and his self-chosen environment, he was an ordinary, uninteresting personality. Mr. Pullman was suave and sociable on all occasions. To the day of his death, Mr. Pullman endured more hours than any man in his employ. He was a glutton for work. The town of Pullman, where the shops are that bear the name of the great man, no word has been heard of his death until newspapermen began to inquire as to the feeling of the townspeople on the subject. The event had been so sudden, and at such an hour, that company officials in the town had heard nothing regarding the death of the chief until after the tollers in the huge car works and kindred establishments had begun the daily routine, all unconscious of the tragic occurrence at the Brownstone Palace, 2 miles further north on the lake shore. Immediately, however, preparations were made to close the shops for the proper observance of Mr. Pullman's obsequies. At the time of his death, George Pullman was one of the richest men in America. He was a household name due to the prolific spread of his invention, the Pullman Palace car. However, his life had not started nearly as well as it ended. George Pullman was born on the 3rd of March, 1831, in Brockton, New York, a small town outside of Buffalo. He was the third of 9 children. However, most of his siblings died before reaching adulthood. He was heavily influenced by his parents' teaching of universalism. This was the opposite of the current sentiments of the time that were expressed during the Second Great Awakening. In universalism, God was not violent, but kind. This influenced his decisions later in life, as he always attempted to be kind to his workers, though in practice he was not. His father was a carpenter, whose specialty was moving buildings with a screw that he patented in 1841. Using this method, Pullman's father was hired to move structures that were in the path of the Erie Canal with his invention. During his childhood, the family was also supported by some of Pullman's older brothers, who built furniture. In 1853, George Pullman, now only 22, took over the family business after his father's death. He continued to help with the construction of the canal by moving houses. Then, seeing an opportunity, Pullman moved to Chicago. When the city was built, it was placed on top of a swamp. Thus, during certain times of year, the city would flood. In addition, the lack of sewers and the practice of throwing trash directly into the streets would make the city horrible to live in during certain times of the year. Thus, the city had decided to raise itself 6 feet up and to install a sewer system in order to get rid of the water and the sewage. Thus, Pullman was able to use the corkscrew he had used to move houses in New York to raise buildings in Chicago. After setting up the business raising buildings, Pullman was bored. He wanted an adventure. He decided to try his luck in the Colorado Gold Rush from 1858 to 1860. He moved a significant amount of money from his Chicago businesses into a fund to cover his expenses. At the time, a lot of gold in the streams in the surface was gone. Thus, gold was mined through taking rock, crushing it up, and then separating the gold. However, to crush the rock required large steam hammers, which were incredibly valuable in Colorado, due to the difficulty of first moving them to the territory, and then moving them to the mountains, and then running them. So Pullman brought one. He used it to mine both gold for himself, in which he did succeed, even though only 1 out of every 20 miners did, and also broke up rocks for others, charging them a fee. In addition, all the miners needed supplies. Thus Pullman built a general store/club in Central City, Colorado to cater to the miners. This endeavor did pay off, as Pullman was able to make a few $1,000s, around $100,000 to $200,000 in today's money. Back in Chicago, the most famous incident was the raising of the Tremont House in 1861. At that time, this was the foremost hotel in Chicago. In 1860, the Republican Convention, where Lincoln was nominated, was held. It would later become the headquarters for the Pullman Palace Car until 1871, when it burned down. In this event, more than 500,000 screws were placed underneath the building by the Pullman Company. Then 500 men went from screw to screw and slowly lifted up the building one turn at a time. As the building rose, business went on as usual in the building. People did not even have to leave the building as it went up. This increased the spectacle and the coverage of the incident. Pullman would not be able to raise buildings forever. The end was near, for there were only so many buildings to raise, and new buildings were being built higher to start with. Thus, Pullman started to develop a new rail car company. In Pullman's experience, train travel was tight and uncomfortable, especially on the week-long transcontinental routes. The current trains had few accommodations for sleeping, often just making the passengers lay on the seats they sat on during the day. There would be benches placed to allow the remaining passengers to lay down. Other trains had 3 tiers of bed, meaning that everyone had a place to sleep, but had trouble moving the beds, meaning that they were cramped when converted into normal seating. In addition, there were no onboard restaurants, meaning that passengers had to quickly eat whenever the train briefly stopped in a station. For these problems, Pullman came up with a completely new type of car. He developed a folding bed system that could fold down beds from the ceiling and made the seats fold out into beds. He added restaurant cars to the trains to serve passengers. With these innovations, the Pullman car quickly became popular. However, he had a big break when in 1865, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater, he convinced Mrs. Lincoln to bring Mr. Lincoln home in a Pullman car, providing invaluable advertising and expanding his brand nationally instead of just in the local Illinois market. Pullman porters also made the trains unique. These men worked aboard the trains, serving every whim of the passengers. These men are what made his car famous and made it so hard for anyone else to come out with competing cars. The Pullman porters were unique in their background. Firstly, they were all former slaves. This made them cheaper to employ, as blacks had fewer opportunities and thus would accept lower wages. These wages and respect from the job were so good that many porter jobs were hereditary and passed down from father to son. Note that the wages were very low as per white standards of the time, and were heavily based on tips, meaning that the porters had to constantly ask for tips, leading them to be compared to monkeys and parrots. In addition, as they were former slaves, Pullman believed that they would be more willing to serve the passengers and know better how to please. The racial inequality was further demonstrated through them being often called George, after their boss, George Pullman, in the same manners that slaves were often called by their master's name. Finally, their black skin made them invisible to upper-class whites on the train. Pullman porters, while living hard lives, did change the country for the better. The movement of black porters around the country helped to spur the great migration of over 6 million blacks from the South to the North in the years following the Civil War. In addition, many of the children of Pullman porters went to colleges and later helped spark the Civil Rights Movement. For example, Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court justice, was the son of a Pullman porter. In addition, many blacks gained service skills while working on the trains and were able to move up to higher level service positions in places as high as the White House. And did help blacks, he did see them different and lower than whites. In addition, Plessy versus Ferguson, the case that established separate but equal, originated from a Pullman train. Thus, it was not perfect for blacks. Throughout the 1870s and the 1880s, Pullman did continue to provide exceptional service and to sell his cars and services on more and more lines. Thus, he needed to expand his factories. He decided he would build the town of Pullman, Illinois. It was about 10 to 12 miles south of Chicago. In it would be houses for workers to live in, shops for them to buy goods in, and of course, the train car factories. The town had many advantages to Pullman, the main one being cost. The workers paid rent on their houses to Pullman, and paid Pullman for their everyday goods. Much of the money that Pullman paid workers came right back to him, allowing him to reduce costs. In addition, the town allowed him to try to make a utopian community with everyone living in harmony. While the utopian dream did not pan out, it did cut costs for Pullman. This town still exists today. This town did cause problems for Pullman. In 1894, there was a recession in the country, leading to a decrease in demand for Pullman cars. Thus, to stay profitable, Pullman cut the wages of all workers by 25%. However, he did not cut the corresponding rents of houses and goods in the town of Pullman. Thus, the workers were unable to pay rent despite working 16 hours days. When the workers went to Pullman, he kicked them out and ordered the delegation to be fired. Pullman then shut down the works and kicked out all the striking workers out of their homes. While this is atrocious, some of the blame must rest on other company executives. From reading Pullman's letters, it is clear that he seemed to think that the workers were happy. However, he got this information from supervisors who wanted to impress him. Thus, he might have been disillusioned about what was actually happening. Regardless of intentions, the strike dragged on for over 2 months. Many of the workers could not find other jobs. There was hunger and starvation. Violence broke out. However, the strike continued to grow as more workers walked off their jobs. The mastermind of the strike was Eugene Debs, later to be a four-time presidential candidate under the Socialist Party. Debs worked to convince workers who ran the trains, such as conductors and rail operators, to leave. This caused the strike to gain more publicity, for previously it had only been the production and cleaning of train cars, not the running of trains. In addition, Pullman started hiring non-union workers, causing the union workers who were still working to leave in even greater numbers. Debs, as the organizer, worked to try to keep the number of riots down. While there were some, many of them did not turn violent and were more of demonstrations. However, the strikers, hungry and out of work and home for over 2 months, turned violent. They went to a local train track and wrecked a train. While the locomotive and most of the cars were owned by Pullman, one of them was a U.S. mail car. This made the U.S. government angry as the protesters were directly destroying U.S. mail. This event also sparked attacks in other areas as workers destroyed property. The U.S. government decided to respond as rail transit was now down throughout the entire country as workers from other companies were also striking at this point. Using the powers given them under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which allowed them to deal with interstate commerce, and under the reason of defending the U.S. mail, federal troops were dispatched to Chicago by Grover Cleveland, the current president. The arrival of troops sparked more riots as protesters destroyed hundreds of rail cars and started to build barricades and fight the troops. It escalated until between 4 and 30 people were killed by troops when they fired into a crowd. At this point, the strike effectively ended and many of the workers were rehired, though without a union. In the end, the strike did not improve conditions, and the ringleaders, including Debs, were formally charged with interfering with the U.S. mail. They went to prison, where Debs would see the teaching of Marx and become a socialist. However, Pullman was affected even more. Due to the size of the strikes, 250,000 people, many saw it as a fight against the rich and greedy corporations. It hurt Pullman's reputation and made him a cold-hearted capitalist as depicted in these cartoons. In memory of the strike, Grover Cleveland made Labor Day a holiday to remember the power that labor has in America and the influence that it has over employers. Pullman died only 3 years later. After his death, his empire was broken up under the Sherman Antitrust Act. In addition, his city was sold off, as it was not in the American spirit. However, his legacy is still around today. The strike against him was the largest in American history and helped to show the power that workers have when they stand together. In addition, Pullman trains still run today in the form of long-distance Amtrak trains that use the same arrangement of beds that Pullman did in his original trains.